Hi, and welcome to the Thriving Farmer podcast, where we hope to inspire, educate, and celebrate sustainable farming and food production. This is your host, Michael. This episode's guest is Dan Kittredge. Now, Dan has been an organic farmer for more than 30 years and is the founder and executive director of the Bionutrient Food Association, an 8-year-old nonprofit organization whose mission is to increase quality in the food supply. Known as one of the leading proponents of nutrient density, Dan has been working to demonstrate the connection between plant health, soil health, carbon sequestration, crop nutritional value, flavor, and human health. So I met Dan, it's got to be at least a decade ago when we were farming in upstate New York. And Sandy Arnold, one of my mentors, said, "Michael, I'm having this conference. I'm inviting Dan. You need to show up." So I did. And I spent 2 days, being highly educated with the details of, how poor our soils actually are and what can be done to remineralize and heal them. And so fascinating work that Dan's doing. I highly recommend, if you do have a chance, to take a workshop by him or at least check out their website. It's an amazing resource list of all things in having better soil and healthier crops. I hope you enjoyed the listen. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
So, Dan, tell us a little bit about your farming background, because you've been in the space now for a while.
Yeah, I grew up on an organic farm, a mixed homestead operation. I was born in Boston, where my parents had a very small backyard with rabbits they raised for meat and as many vegetables as they could fit. But when I was 4, they bought some land in central Massachusetts, built a passive solar house with a root cellar and a wood stove for heat and hot water and cooking, and started a homestead, basically. We had a milk cow and pigs and chickens and ducks and geese and turkeys and sheep and orchardry and full mixed vegetables. Early in the organic community, helped and have been continued to run an organic farming organization called NOFA, Northeast Organic Farming Association. But we started a farmer's market in our town in, I think it was 84, and was certified organic in 86, started a CSA in 91, have been doing sales to health food stores and retreat centers and places like that. A mixed small holding, I think, would be the proper explanation of my background growing up. After I got married and realized that I needed to make a living, and the model that I had been brought up on was one that didn't involve, fiscal solvency, I dialed it in a little bit more well and really prioritized some pretty much restaurant sales in Boston. Which actually really was quite helpful beyond the agronomic practices of really creating an environment where the crops were much healthier, focusing on fewer crops and more specific markets where I could have a pretty much of a guaranteed market all year long if I could produce the crops at good prices. That really was the model that I've settled into.
Yeah. So your parents were kind of like I don't say founders, but one of the beginning organic farmers in Massachusetts, correct?
I think they were certified organic. If it wasn't the first year certification existed, it was the second year. There was an organic farming organization called NOFA that started in New Hampshire and Vermont in the late 70s, and other chapters around the Northeast started up in the early 80s. But it was a small grassroots organization, and I think it was actually going under in the mid 80s when my parents took it over. Basically, it was going bankrupt, and they didn't start it, but they certainly helped keep it alive in a moment when it was tenuous.
Yes. Yeah. And I've been to your parents' farm. It's so cool what they've done on that place. And as you said, the house is amazing. It's really, really cool to sit there and spend time at the kitchen table.
The center of the house. Yep.
Yes. Yeah. So let's talk about, you were raised with this, but why do you farm now? What really brings the joy of it now?
Well, I can't find anything else that feels more fulfilling. It's a pretty significant part of it. I spent my 20s doing a bit of traveling and work. I worked for a presidential political campaign. I worked for the global anti-GMO campaign in India. I was a 9/11 truth activist. I was, I bopped around and did a bunch of things and was looking for something that called me. And I always came back to the farm and worked on the farm spring, summer, and fall, and then traveled in the winter. And, when I had to get serious and I got married and I was like, okay, I'm going to have a family, it was less about me and more about my family more broadly. And I just found the lifestyle on the land with community, with family, to be more whole, more complete, more fulfilling, has the potential to be more, I don't know. I feel like a lot of the options in today's day and age for how to live a life in a house, in a job, in the suburbs, etc., they just don't provide that full spectrum of pleasure, fulfillment, meaning, gratification. I don't know what it is exactly, but it's that lifestyle that's in relatively close contact with nature that is what drives me.
So talk to us a little bit more about the nutrition side, because you've really started to focus a lot more on that. Tell us what brought you into focusing on the more nutrient dense aspect.
How much of the story do you want? The real story is after I had taken off to the Himalayas on a sort of a spiritual quest and spent a couple winters up there, had gotten to a point with my own practice, there was more energy flowing through me than my body could handle. If you read the biodynamic lectures by Steiner, there's a quote in the beginning of that book where Aaron Reed Pfeiffer, who is Steiner's primary student who sort of brought biodynamics to North America, Pfeiffer says to Steiner, why is it that when we sit down to meditate and we're able to achieve somewhat augmented states of consciousness, why is it that when we get up to go about our day that we lose it? Why can't we maintain that consciousness through our day? And Steiner said, because your food does not have enough soul force. And that's something that I've been talking to people in the biodynamic community about for a while now, is like, what did Steiner mean by that statement? And so it's a long analysis, but my basic thought was, if my purpose in life, internally was to, achieve a higher state of consciousness, and I felt like, these practices of deeper meditation, et cetera, were part of that process. What I found was that my body was unable to hold the intensity of consciousness. Physiologically, vibrationally, my body couldn't handle it. And I thought, if I grew up on an organic farm eating all this wonderful food in close contact in nature and my body can't handle consciousness, then I shouldn't be so judgmental in looking around at people in the world and wishing they were coming from a higher place. So it's a long conversation, but as I've deepened my understanding, I've developed a few sort of basic metaphors to try to explain the concept. And I don't know if this is where I should be going with this interview, but it certainly is the actual deeper driver here for me. And I think we can circle back down to the practical implications of it shortly. When I got into university, I got in as a music major, and so the metaphor of music was something that I understand. I like to use the example of, if anybody's ever gone to an elementary school band concert, and that sound of, it's really, really sweet. All these little kids are here playing their trumpets and flutes and, whatever, but it's grating on the ears, right? That noise Absolutely. That is called dissonance. There's a technical term for it, the vibrating out of tune. But if you go into a beautiful a cappella choir, 4 voices singing perfectly in tune, sometimes you'll hear a fifth note called an overtone or a harmonic. It'll become manifest even when no one is actually making that sound. That's so when you're vibrating in attunement, in tune, the higher octaves become manifest. And so I like to think of our bodies, our physical bodies, as these sort of vibrating liquid crystals. If you think about it, they say 75% of our body is water, but if you actually do the molecular analysis, these are all the molecules in your body. Well, water is a small molecule and protein's a big one. So 98% of the molecules in your body are water. And if you understand physics, you understand that all these molecules in chemistry are actually vibrations in physics. And so we're basically a big bag of water that's, doped with a few different compounds. And so we're vibrating. We're constantly putting out this vibrational field. If you think about it, we've all got a vibe. And I like to say, if you understand how your body builds itself, we're not like tractors or cars that are designed to have the mufflers taken out and new mufflers put in, or brake pads taken out and new brake pads put in. Our bodies are constantly rebuilding themselves.
Yes.
Every single day you get 4 billion new cells or whatever the number is. Your eyeballs, your liver, your flesh, your blood, your bones are constantly rebuilding themselves. And they're rebuilding themselves out of what you eat. And this is where it comes down to really, really practical for the farming side of things. And inside of every cell is a nucleus. Inside of every nucleus is DNA. DNA is a really big, long, complicated compound. It takes a bunch of different enzymes and things to build DNA. if you do the math, if you track it out, check out the biochemistry, it takes 25 different elements to build one strand of DNA. Not like 5 coppers and 3 zincs. No, like copper, zinc, manganese, boron, cobalt, molybdenum, selenium, chromium, vanadium, yttrium. Keep going. 25 different elements, 4 billion times a day, just for basic bodily maintenance. If you don't have those 25 different elements in your food, because your food has not been grown well in harmony with, biological principles, if you've only got 10 or 12, well then, some of those critical things you need for your body to build itself are not there. And basically when your DNA replicates, you get these things called genetic markers, breaks in the DNA. And so we have then the dynamics that are sort of set the stage for disease, chronic illness broadly, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, you name it. Those things which are managed but not cured has its root basically in mineral deficiency in your food. So not only is it degenerative disease, but its coherence. So I like to think of it as DNA is a molecule in chemistry, but it's a vibration in physics. And if you have in your food all the nutrients you need to build your body properly, then your DNA vibrates like that a cappella choir. And if you don't, then your DNA vibrates like that elementary school band concert. And you physiologically will fall apart or stay coherent, depending to a large degree on what you eat. So it started off, this whole process for me is a very selfish process of, trying to deepen my own path. Was like, I need to eat food that's more nutritious for me to go deeper in my path. And then realizing, oh my God, so many people are struggling. They're good people. They mean well, but they physiologically can't hold it together. We could do a lot of good in this world if we could increase the nutrient levels in food. Because if you look at the USDA, numbers for what average nutrient levels are present in crops over the past 80 years or, 100 years, however long you want to look, the numbers have been dropping ever since they were monitoring them. The levels of degenerative disease, of chronic illness have been going up. The levels and nutrient levels in food have been going down. So there's an opportunity here by focusing on food that's nutritious to address that issue on the human side. But then on the environmental side, for those who care about the climate and things like that, the only way for plants to get these nutrients into them is through a well-functioning microbiome. And that, by the way, sequesters carbon. The only way you feed the microbiome is with sugar, which is made out of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So plants basically take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, convert it into sugar, inject it into the soil to feed the soil life. That soil life then digests the soil and feeds the plants, but as a byproduct of that is actually sequestering carbon, yielding soil, obviating the need for agrochemicals and fertilizers. And so I'm, going rapidly, jumping around various different topics, but from my perspective, focusing on nutrition and food as an obvious thing that we can coalesce around has corollary benefits, which are quite profound. And environmentally, I would say spiritually, but certainly from a health perspective. But what really drove me personally in all this stuff was I needed to make a living farming. And the organic practices I was brought up with involved plants that were susceptible to infestation and disease. And so that correlated with a decrease in economic viability. And so I needed to figure out how to make a living farming because I wanted the lifestyle, but I didn't know how to make it economically viable. And so backdoor, by growing plants healthily, you not only decrease your cost of production, increase the nutrient levels in the crops, you also increase the environmental health benefits. And so I said, if I grew up on an organic farm and my parents run an organic farming organization and I'd never heard about any of this stuff, then there's probably other people of similar ilk who have not heard about this kind of stuff that would be interested. And so that's led me onto the process of sort of doing more education work and organizing and not just farming.
Wow, that is an incredible story. So let's talk about, obviously this took some research. Who would you say were your mentors in this area? And kind of what were the top takeaways that you kind of came with as you started down this journey?
I think Acres USA is where I got most of my download from.
Okay.
It was probably 10 or 12 years ago when I started going to the conferences and a lot of the elders were still alive. So, Bruce Tanio is now passed. He was brilliant. Jerry Bernetti is now passed. He was brilliant. Charles Walters, the founder of Acres, is now passed. He was brilliant. Dan Scow, the student of Reams. Certainly you've got, we have a whole pantheon of elders in this space, I think. still going out there kicking strong. You got Elaine Ingham and Christine Jones and, Gary Zimmer and there's a younger generation of people coming up that are quite good. John Kemp obviously is well studied in all this kind of stuff. So I would say, I never really had one mentor per se, but Arden Anderson was another one. He was early on one of the people who had put together this understanding about agronomy and human health and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, I would say the Acres community was the place that I dialed in.
Yeah, that is such a great resource for farmers in all kinds of niches and different types of farming. So talk about sustainability. What does sustainability mean? What does the sustainable agriculture look like right now?
I think one of the sort of the pushbacks against the term sustainability is that if you want to maintain this low level of, sustainability basically means you sustain where you're at, and where we're at is a relatively low level of vitality. And so, there's been this sort of reframing of regenerative or biological to imply that, sustainable traditionally has meant something along the lines of let's not be so toxic, let's not be so harmful to the environment. And so it's, we're not going to say organic because that's too high of a bar to meet, but we'll say sustainable and try to find a middle ground. And I think where we're at now is that we can't afford to sustain the low level of vitality we've got in our ecosystem. We need to regenerate it, revitalize it, revivify it. So I don't really give much credence to one term over another. It's more about the deeper conversation. So what do you mean by sustainability? What's your what's your intention with using that word?
Yeah, so I guess what to me would be, so many, as you said earlier, so many farms out there are failing. And I think to me, sustainability is on so many levels. Obviously, sustainability that the farm can keep operating, that the farmer doesn't burn out, that the soils are getting better and better every single year, that they're just sustaining production. So I think, and that's why I like to ask this, is I think sustainability is so many different levels. And to everyone I interview, it's a little bit different.
Yeah, well, I think the way we need to look at it is successfully achieving multiple objectives. So farm viability, has to exist. You have to have farm viability for the farmers to stay in business. And you need to have the psychic time, the downtime, the family time, the rest time as part of that cycle. If you're going 80, 90 hours a week, you're going to burn out. And so that's not sustainable. And it would be nice to have, a few $1,000s in the bank account at the end of the year too, not, just scrabbling constantly. So, for me, that was really that one thing, economic viability, is what drove the rest of this for me. And part of why I spend so much time now out on the circuit lecturing and doing workshops and courses and conferences and things like that is because, I think we can not only provide that economic viability, sustainability for growers, but we can actually provide health and healing for the people that are eating our food and for the environment where we're growing it. Yeah, I like to think of something much more expansive, rejuvenation, revitalization, something along those lines. That's my objectives to be working towards culturally, environmentally, health, then the spiritual domains, et cetera.
Yeah. So you said earlier, you talked about how over the last 80 to 100 years, every single year, the crops get less and less nutritious. That started with the soil. Talk to us about the great demineralization of the soil and our food. How is that affecting us now, and how do you see us changing that?
Well, I think, like I said before, the way that plants have evolved to be fed is through their gut flora. I like to say, on none of the first 6 days did God invent fertilizer. Triple superphosphate, ammonium, urea, compost and chicken manure, liquid fish, all this stuff that people put onto their fields. Nature doesn't need it. Nature has figured out a way for plants to flourish without having all this stuff added to it. And nature really doesn't like being tilled. And nature does not do monocultures. I think that nature holds the answers to our problems. And it's been our hubris in thinking that we know better and we can impose our will on nature, which has foundationally caused this kind of stuff to occur in the first place. So when you till up the soil and you keep it tilled or bare on a regular basis, you functionally cause genocide in the microbial community. It's those different microbes. It's like if you added antibiotics to somebody's system on a regular basis. You would cause genocide on their microbial community. That has a major systemic negative effect on the organism. So the gut flora of the animal is effectively similar in its relevance to the gut flora of the plant. And so I think it's basically that we have been managing soil without an understanding of the critical importance of microbes that has caused a lot of this to occur. Certainly that has been exacerbated by the toxins, by the fungicides and insecticides, by the fertilizers, which really are like an IV drip that can be injected into the bloodstream of the plant. We are not evolved to eat the food through an IV drip. We're evolved to eat food through, digestion. The plant is not evolved to eat food through an IV drip. Anything that's a fertilizer is functionally an IV drip. If it has a number on the bag, it's soluble. Soluble means it's not digested by life. It's going directly into the bloodstream. So we have foundationally a number of things that we do in our agricultural practices which are not keeping with nature's process. And so, all of those things have conspired. I think the work in plant breeding to develop crops that are thick-walled, uniform shape, ripen at a certain time, we actually selected for traits that were not nutritional traits, but were economic traits from a mass production standpoint. And so, actually we've bred plants to be less nutritious, and then we've created an environment where their microbiome is not functioning, and so they're subsisting on a really simple, 3 to 5 element diet. So it's not hard to understand at all how this has come to pass. But it's because we've been thinking that all crops are the same. We've been thinking that a carrot is a carrot is a carrot, that milk is milk. And if you start to look into the data about it, there's actually massive variations. I think, Joel Salatin was telling me a story a couple of years ago, or maybe it's almost a couple of years ago now, that he'd been part of a research project that, that Mother Earth News had, got $10,000, and they were working with some pastured egg growers, and they had taken eggs from 10 different farms that were doing pastured poultry and run them through the same lab that the USDA uses to do, nutrient analysis on eggs. And the USDA average for beta carotene in egg, that which makes the yolks, orange, I think it was 52 parts per million. And Joel's eggs were 1,049 parts per million, 4,000% more. That's just one example of one element, one compound in one crop on one farm versus the USDA average. But some milk is a 1-to-1 omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, which is considered to be very health-giving. Some milk is 4-to-1, which is, according to the American Heart Association, as bad for you as bacon. Doesn't matter if it's organic milk. Doesn't matter if it's local milk. What matters is how the cows were raised and what's in the crop we're harvesting from them. Its effect on you correlates with its effect on the cows, correlates with its effect on the ecosystem. Cows are supposed to be eating grass. When cows eat grass, they make milk that's good for you. When they eat grain in a CAFO, they make milk that's bad for you. We have the USDA averages which say this is what the average of nutrient levels are in food in this country this year. But the reality is there's just massive variation in nutrient levels in food, in the farmer's market, potentially in the grocery store. You buy this milk versus that milk, you'll have an entirely different nutritional profile. And so our hope is that we can raise awareness amongst the consumers about the fact that there is this major variation, about how it correlates to their health and the health of their children, about how it correlates to the health of the environment. And then we can give consumers the ability to make purchasing decisions based on quality, not on label or marketing.
Wow. That was really good. So kind of one of the things I'm pulling out of here is you were almost saying, to heck with the labels, let's actually test the food.
That's been the project I've been proposing for a number of years, and we've only recently had the capacity to implement it. But yeah, over the past couple of years, I like to use the example of Alpha Centauri, which is a star 8 light years away, and we've never sent a probe, a spaceship past the edge of the solar system, which is like a light month maybe, or a light, 2 weeks away. Alpha Centauri is 8 light years away. If you ask any astrophysicist what Alpha Centauri is made up of, they'll tell you with great confidence, Alpha Centauri is 51% hydrogen, 48% helium, 1% other gases, and these levels and ratios. And you're like, how the hell did you figure that out? We've never gone to Alpha Centauri. How do you know? And they know because of this science called spectroscopy, which basically is every element in chemistry, like copper, is a frequency in physics. Copper vibrates at a certain speed. And so when you look at the light coming off of Alpha Centauri, you can read what it's made up of based on the different frequencies of light that are coming from it. If you look into the sky, at night, you'll see some stars are more yellow, some are more white, some are more red. They have different things in them, which is causing their light to be different colors. So, there have been spectrometers around for 40 or 50 years. The field is well developed. There's spectrometers on the, International Space Station. They're on the Mars rovers. They're in various labs. They've always costed lots of money, but now with the rapid development of the consumer handheld market with smartphones, basically, a lot of these technologies, which used to cost millions of dollars, now cost like 50 cents or $2 to build. Right? The sensors, the chips, like a fancy camera that could do the things your iPhone 8 could do. I mean, how much would that have cost if it was even possible? Right? So all a spectrometer is something similar to a camera. You just flash a light at the carrot with your camera flash, and you read the light that bounces back. It's a different sensor. It's a different sensor than the one that's taking the picture, but it's basically the same kind of thing. And so the upshot is that we now have the capacity to go to the farmer's market, go to the grocery store, flash a light at a carrot, and get a reading back off of it. We've done this now with our organization. We've built these, first generation of handheld spectrometers. We don't have them calibrated yet, so we can't tell you what it means. We can get the reading off of it, but we don't have enough data to tell you what the reading means. So it's going to be another year before we actually have the tools calibrated for consumer use. But we're really rapidly dialing this thing in where we're going to be able to go to the grocery store and say, this CalOrganic carrot is at 18 out of 100 on the continuum of quality, and these Bunny Love carrots are 40 out of 100. And so you can choose based on the nutritional value of the food, what to purchase. And our hope is that we can use economic incentive. Consumers are buying food that's more nutritious. So then therefore the crops that are less nutritious are not being bought. So then therefore we have an incentive for the supply chain to focus on nutrition, not just aesthetic and volume. So it's an exciting project that we're in the midst of. And there's a couple pieces of it that are critically important beyond building the tool, which are like, what is the variation of nutrient levels in carrots? Because with all the study of food that's gone on, at least in the open literature, in the public literature, there is no data set which says this is the variation within carrots of nutrient levels. This is the variation within milk. This is the variation within cucumbers. It doesn't seem to exist. So we're building that out. Before we can say this is at 18 out of 100, this is 80 out of 100, we have to define that variation. That's basically what we're doing now. We're handing out our first generation of these tools, which are developer kits. And we're working with universities and companies and farmers and organizations, et cetera, to do this project. I'm not sure if I'm getting ahead of myself.
No, that's
your questions. You're just kind of letting me roll. So keep
that's
rolling.
Great. That's what this. It's just a conversation between us. This is fascinating. So this is really cool. So you're thinking within a year, then you'll be able to start basically saying, "Hey guys, this is where we are. This is what a nutritious carrot is. This is what a non-nutritious carrot is, or less nutritious, because there's probably some sort of nutrition in it."
It's a continuum, right?
Yeah.
It's always something.
Yeah. Obviously, the marketing side, getting that out there. Tell us about how you guys are planning on, just basically telling the world about this after you actually have something that people can take in their hand to the grocery store.
Well, in the next year, our annual conference, the Soil Nutrition Conference, is coming up in a week. So we're handing out the first generation of these tools then. And we're going to be working with partners. I mean, literally, I think we've got every continent covered except for Australia. We've got people on 6 continents who are going to be using these tools to build data sets. Obviously, a lot of them here in North America, but everywhere else, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia.
I got some connections in Australia that we should chat after the interview.
It's about collaboration. It's about this thing. We're a nonprofit educational organization. Everything we're doing is open source. The engineering for the tool is in the commons. Anybody can download it and make their own. The data set's in the commons. The app is built in the commons. So our thought is that this is information that belongs to the people. I think to the smallholders. The smallholders are my, I have a bias. Yep. I want to give the smallholders everything that they need to be viable, economically viable, self-sufficient. I've worked in, villages in India and seen people starving to death and, selling their children into prostitution because that's the only way to stay alive. Like, we have visceral issues for hundreds of millions, if not billions of people planet-wide because the land is in such rough shape. And if we can help them understand best practices for how to rebuild vitality in the soil, regenerate vitality in the soil, we can have a really powerful positive impact globally. So we're doing this project. People are we're handing out the tools. We've built a lab. We're partnering with other labs. And my hope is that there's a slow build through the year of data as we begin to collect it, where we say, look, here's the variation in milk. And we've got partners that have, that are NGOs that can do press releases. Look, here's a variation in carrot, et cetera. So it seems to me, I don't have a big marketing plan. Everything we've done so far has been grassroots and word of mouth. We're going to be having this sort of a standalone handheld tool that a consumer can use ready in a year. But in 2 years, the chips are going to be in smartphones. It'll be in 300 million smartphones. And I think that with the correlations between plant health and carbon sequestration, which are pretty direct, you're going to get, a lot of people that are concerned about the climate to be starting to push awareness about this. With the epidemic levels of degenerative disease that are becoming, I just read something today. It said it's going to be a 20% increase in diabetes in the next 10 years. It's only 100 million more people are going to have diabetes 10 years from now than have it now. We see the levels of autism and all the rest of the stuff amplifying. And so the consumers who care about their health and the health of their children, who are dialed into this kind of stuff, I think are also going to be talking about this kind of stuff. So I would like a broad-based grassroots education campaign, not a big marketing campaign. We're not making any money off of this thing. It's a hassle to raise the money to do the work to put the data into the commons. It's not like we're a company that's going to have a big rollout of a tool and have a economic like a market cap of $2 billion. There's nothing to own. Yeah. Everything we're doing is in the commons, and so we're saying whoever gets this and wants to collaborate, we're only going to be able to pull this off together. Tell your friends, and I think it's going to pop.
Yeah.
Whatever. We'll see, I guess.
Yeah, no, super cool. I mean, some of the biggest movements in the world were grassroots. So I absolutely think that you have the potential there to do that. And, it comes back to there's nothing more ferocious than a mom who, has felt like she's been lied to by the food community.
The health of your child is like much more important than anything else. And you will violate all ethical norms.
Yes.
If your child's well-being is. So let's make it peaceful. Let's say that the radical political act is to buy the carrots that are more flavorful. You can heal your child, heal the environment, and heal the political dialogue by feeding your children food that's more flavorful, which they're more likely to eat, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this whole other thing about the most sophisticated nutrient sensor ever designed is your nose and your tongue. We're hardwired to discern this stuff because, it's in our evolutionary self-interest.
Yes.
And the reason people don't like their fruits and vegetables is because they don't taste good, is because they're not good for them.
Exactly.
Children are animals, and if carrots taste good, they'll eat carrots. I've got 4 kids, and I've seen my kids fight over carrots.
Yeah.
The 1-year-old rips the carrot out of his 4-year-old brother's hand. I want that.
Yes.
Right? He's barely got teeth, and he's fighting for the carrot.
Yeah.
So, if we're producing crops like that, they'll be consumed. Most of us aren't doing it. This is the thing that we farmers need to be really humble about. A lot of what we're producing is not sufficient, and that's part of why we're not succeeding. Is because the crops are at a low ebb of health and vigor. My experience as a farmer is when my plants become healthier, my cost of production drops, my shelf life increases, my market availability increases. I work with fancy chefs. They want stuff that tastes good, that'll sit in the cooler for a while, right? And a reasonable price. I can sell everything I can produce and make good money and not work that many hours a week because my plants are healthy. John Kemp does this thing about corn. He talks about the economic, the yield potential of corn. And he says, if you talk to the corn geneticists at Iowa State or Purdue or whatever, they'll tell you that the yield potential on the field corn that's on the market today is something between 1,000 and 1,200 bushels to the acre. And if you talk to the USDA, National Record Service, they say that the average yield is 160 bushels per acre. And if you were a student at university and you got 160 out of 1,000 on your final exam, you'd be a failure.
Yeah.
Right? This is the thing. The yield potential on tomatoes, is hundreds of pounds per plant, and the average yield is between 5 and 15 pounds per plant.
Yeah.
When you have healthy plants, they're more productive. And it doesn't mean more fertilizer, it doesn't mean more chemicals. It means a more well-functioning microbial ecosystem in the soil and on the leaf surface. Mm. And the practices necessary to get there, in most cases, don't involve buying stuff. They involve an understanding of what the living system is and how to work with it. So in many cases, there's these really simple, obvious limiting factors that people are missing out on, like not enough air. Your soil's too tight, not enough air. All the microbes asphyxiate and die. The plant can't be fed by them. Not enough air in the soil will short circuit your process. And like you can have fancy tractors and expensive fertilizer and your plants still aren't going to grow because you have not managed the soil in such a way as to create the environment for the microbes to flourish.
No, that's good. So let's kind of shift a little bit because we've kind of talked about the spectrometer you're building out, the bionutrient meter, and let's talk about some practical steps for, let's say, a new farmer. Let's say a new farmer gets a new property. What's the first thing that you suggest they do? Maybe even before they get that property. What are the steps that they're going to take to get to a fully mineralized farm if you can ever get there?
It depends, of course, entirely on where you are. You know, if you're in the United States and you're out west, you probably have almost all the minerals you need in your soil. So mineral deficiency is not your issue. You probably don't have enough water. You probably don't have enough organic matter. You probably don't have enough air. So when I give my courses, I say, I do my sort of opening shtick, and then I say, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter what kind of crop you're growing. It could be a cucumber or alfalfa or an apple tree. As far as I'm concerned, they all need a set of the same basic environmental conditions. They need air. The soil needs air for the microbes to breathe. It's not about the plant, it's about the microbes, right? You can create the environment for the microbes and the plant will take care of the rest of it. The microbes need air to breathe. They need water to drink. They need organic matter to eat, which is ideally coming down from the leaves in the form of sugar. But also, if it's wintertime, they need some organic matter in the soil. So air, water, food. They themselves must be present, the microbes. In many cases, if you've applied chemicals in the past or whatever, the microbial communities are knocked out. Many species are no longer present. They've been extincted in that soil. And then you need minerals for the biochemistry to occur. So you need a nice spectrum of, copper and zinc and boron and manganese and cobalt and molybdenum, as well as your basic nitrogen and potassium and phosphorus and calcium and things like that. So basically, I would say assess the dynamic of the soil based on those metrics. Is it tight? Is it dry? Is it bare? Is it alive? You basically want to address limiting factors. My suggestion is identify limiting factors and address them, and then get out of the way because nature figured this thing out. But of course, it depends entirely on the individual and what their intentions are, what kind of crops, what their economic situation is, what the history of the land is, the climatic dynamics, etc.
Yeah.
I mean, well.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, remineralization can be expensive. What's the best way to do it if you're at scale?
Remineralization?
Yeah. Just step out of the way and let nature work at it?
Well, we plant cover crops because we think we know what nature wants. And she actually plants her own cover crops. And so if you've got a calcium deficiency, she'll put in, dock and, a dandelion. If you've got a boron deficiency, she'll put in, nettles. If you're willing to wait a couple 100 years for nature to go through the process of using these bioaccumulator plants to remineralize soils, then nature totally will. But if it's just minerals you're looking at, then we have in seawater and rock dust the full spectrum of minerals. And so the continents are made out of rock and the oceans are made out of seawater. And so we have plenty of the raw materials necessary to remineralize our soils freely available, effectively freely available, or at the price of $2 a ton or something like that for rock dust. My thought is, again, I'm trying to put together a protocol that works for smallholders globally who have little, if any, money for fertility. Jerry Brunetti said 75 pounds of sea salt per acre per year, end of conversation. East of the Mississippi, for sure. Depending on how far west you get, maybe you've got enough, too much salt in the soil. But sea salt, dug up in Kansas at $100 a ton, 75 pounds per acre of that is like, you do your math. It's like $5, $8.
Yeah.
Not much. Finely ground basalt rock dust, which is the waste product at, quarries around the planet, is a waste product. And they will oftentimes give it to you for free or for $2 a ton or $4 a ton. It costs more to drive it across town than it costs to buy it. Yeah. And so if you've got a well-functioning biological system, these minerals you need can be sourced extremely inexpensively and need not be any significant burden on your budget. But the broader the spectrum of families of plants in the soil, the broader the spectrum of microbes. because every family of plants has its own gut flora. In the same way that cows have a different gut flora than humans do, grasses have a different gut flora than forbs do, right? And so basically different microbes have the functional capacity to digest, solubilize, make available different elements. Getting a broad spectrum of species of plants growing well, a broad spectrum of microbes present in the environment is also really, really helpful. It's a balancing act depending on what you have a good level of, what you don't have enough of, et cetera, et cetera. I can't make a grand statement and say it's just this.
Gotcha, because there's so many different options. Yeah.
Ideas. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're talking about sea salt. Now, could, let's say, a coastal farmer pump on seawater, or is that gonna really mess things up?
Certainly you can pump on seawater, or you can take rock salt, which is basically ancient sea salt, and add water to it. That's what I'm suggesting. The Kansas sea salt, which is the whole middle of the U.S. used to be an ocean, and there's these 40 to 100 foot thick beds of salt in the subsoil that are mined across the Midwest. 300 million years old, doesn't have any toxins in it, no radioactive isotopes from Fukushima, no plastics, no carcinogens that are in the seawater now, even if it's at low levels. You don't have to go to the ocean to get seawater. I mean, you can take sea salt and add water to it, but seawater is a wonderful thing if you can get your hands on it. Some people are concerned about the sodium and the chlorine because at high levels they can be detrimental. At low levels, they're critical, they're necessary. And in many cases, if it rains too much where you live, anything above 30 inches of rain a year probably has functionally leached out most of these anions. A lot of the nutrients that you'd like to have there aren't there. Sodium and chlorine being two of them. Sea salt is a very beneficial thing. It is also very easy to precipitate out the sodium and chlorine and just get the trace elements out of seawater with the use of lye. Really, really simple. You can make lye out of wood ashes. So wood ashes plus seawater, and you can make this really high test trace mineral concentrate that you want to apply at the rate of a pint per acre maybe to have a really significant benefit. We're not talking about a lot of stuff here.
Yeah.
Right. We're just addressing the limiting factors and get out of the way. And so, how much yttrium does your soil need? Not a hell of a lot.
Yeah.
1 pound of molybdenum per acre, and every plant. I mean, I've got a 12-hour stand-up show I do. So I'm just bopping all over the place, giving highlights and talking points and things like that. But yeah.
Yeah, and that was actually, I came to yours, it was got to have been at least 10 years ago in Saratoga Springs. And
it wasn't quite 10, but it was probably at least 8.
Okay. But yeah.
I think I've only been doing it for 10 years. So you weren't the first year, I don't think.
Yeah. But it completely changed my view of soil nutrition and really, just how I saw that. And yeah, we started making some big changes after that. So let's talk about compost. A lot of people apply a ton of compost and think that's the answer to their problems.
Yep.
And not necessarily.
I say there's a couple things I don't do on my farm. One of them is I don't kill insects. I don't kill diseases, and I don't add compost.
Okay.
I don't add in general, but as somebody who's practicing, following organic practices, certifiably organic practices, I'm obviously not using triple superphosphate. I mean, where in nature are all of the, organic residues piled up, turned over, pulled off the land, piled up, turned over, and put back on the land?
Yeah.
Where does nature do that? I don't think she really does. Yeah, that's the answer. It doesn't. Nature drops organic matter where it came from. Nature covers the entire soil with a nice thick layer of organic matter and digests slowly in situ. And so it's not only less work, but it's much less destructive to the biological system. I certainly am a big fan of cover crops, big fan of undersowing, things underneath plants, mulching. I say, where do you see bare soil in nature? And the answer I'm, looking for is not where she's doing well. Maybe in the desert. Yeah. In the desert, you see bare soil, but how well is nature doing in the desert? She's not doing well. So wherever you see a well-functioning ecosystem, you don't see bare soil. And so keeping your soil covered basically facilitates that composting process right there. I think it's 15 earthworms per square yard equals 40,000 pounds of earthworm castings per acre per year, which is 20 tons, which is 1 pound per square foot, which you could never afford. And it's applied in a slow release, through the season. It's not all put down at once. It's distributed, regularly throughout the season. So if you keep your soil covered with mulch or whatever, cover crops or things like that, you will get 20 tons of earthworm castings deposited on your farm per acre for free with no labor and no cost. And so there's your compost. Nature will make it for you. Nature will distribute it for you if you create the environment necessary for her to do that job. Basically, the way I see it is we're leveraging the capacity of the bottom of the food chain to make it so we don't need all these other products. You don't need fertilizers. You don't need insecticides. You don't need, all this machinery necessarily. If you're creating an environment where nature's doing the work, you're getting those high yields of healthy crops for much lower cost. It's a big shift in thinking, and, it goes counter to a lot of what's in books, the general farming books and stuff like that. I don't think quite reach out this far. I go and give workshops in cities at community gardens and sort of, inner city projects, and, it's compost is all it is. I mean, that's just the compost. You put compost down and you've got everything done you need to do. I'm like, guys, it looks like soil, right? But what happens when you fill that wooden, box with this compost? When you come back next year, it's not full anymore, right? It's like, it went down by a couple inches. Like I said, do you know what happened there? Like, I don't know. I'm like, that, for starters, it's not soil, it's compost.
Yeah.
Because soil is mostly like crushed up rock, right? 90% of the hard matter and soil is rock. It's not organic matter. And compost is just organic matter. There's no rock in it. Like, that organic matter oxidized and turned into carbon dioxide. So you have been responsible for increased carbon levels in the atmosphere because of the way you're growing your vegetables. This organic matter turned into carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. You're not growing in soil. You need to grow in soil. Soil doesn't do that. Soil builds over time. It doesn't wear out over time. I'm not sure if I've answered your compost question sufficiently, but
no, that was good.
Certainly, I don't have a problem with compost. If you want to use it, fine. If you don't have the pathways set up for your plants to be harvesting their nitrogen from the atmosphere, which they in nature are able to do, if those pathways are still broken and you feel like you need to add compost, fine. Maybe put your rock dust into the compost pile when you're building it, because that'll make those minerals much more bioavailable. There's things you can do, inoculate your compost pile so you ensure a broad spectrum of microbes, so you can help reestablish that gut flora of the soil with your compost pile. Use more woody materials and don't turn it so much so that you have more of a fungal dominance in your compost pile as opposed to a bacterial dominance. There's certainly things you can do to make compost a much more beneficial amendment. I'm not saying thou shalt not use compost. I'm saying it shouldn't be necessary.
Gotcha. Yeah. But it might be a great way to kind of jumpstart things as you're moving toward your ideas.
It's a really powerful thing, right? So if you're already making compost, I would say, Elaine England went into this in great detail about the bacterial and fungal dominances in soil, and what causes weeds to grow well is a bacterial dominance in your soil, which you get by tilling your soil, and you get by having, sort of more green carbons in your compost pile than brown carbons. So if you put wood chips or sawdust or any woody material, lignified carbon in your compost pile, only fungi can digest that. Bacteria can't digest that. And so the compost pile will go through this process of bacterial flush, and then it'll move on to a fungal dominance if you let it sit for long enough and you have the proper kinds of ingredients. Put your minerals in your compost pile, put your woody materials in your compost pile, don't turn it so much, and you'll have a much, much, much more appropriate amendment fertilizer for your field. Nature will tell you, what's doing well and what's not. If you had a dairy herd and they were being eaten alive by maggots, right? If their flesh was being eaten alive by larvae of flies, you'd say something is really wrong with my cows. If you've got potato plants and the Colorado potato beetles coming in and eating your potato plants, you're like, well, that's normal. I'll spray for the beetles, but there's no big deal there. That's where I came from. My plants are being eaten alive by larvae. I'm like, that's normal. No, that's nature telling you something's wrong. If you're being eaten alive by a flesh-eating fungus, if you've got a systemic staph infection, if all your meat birds are being eaten alive by staph infection, you're not going to, in good conscience, slaughter and sell those meat birds or feed them to your children. But if your summer squash has powdery mildew and you're still picking it, that's a flesh-eating fungus, right? That squash is not at optimal vitality and nutrition. Anyway, there's all these different ways of looking at it, but the point I was going to make was if the pigweed is growing better than the spinach, nature's telling you the pigweed is more nutritious than the spinach.
Yeah.
It is. However, if you've got the soil tuned differently, if you've got a fungal dominance in that soil, the pigweed is going to be eaten by aphids and the spinach is going to flourish. My experience is when I've got my soil really humming along, my crops outcompete my weeds. The need to do, unending hours of weeding just disappears because I've created an environment where the crop that I want to be growing there is flourishing. And that's when nature's telling you you're doing a good job, is when the plants that you're trying to grow there are flourishing. They're growing better than anybody else. They're inherently and entirely resistant to insect and pest pressure. That's when you get the high yields. That's when you get the low cost of production. That's when you get the carbon sequestration. That's when you get the, higher nutrient levels in those crops.
Very interesting. So kind of to wrap this up here, let's kind of talk a little bit about going to the next generation. What things do you see people struggling with? You travel around a lot, and what kind of things do you, obviously nutrition is one of them, but what kind of other things do you try to tell them as they're starting out on this journey of farming?
I just try to review the basic topics I've discussed here, which is that the only way you're going to be successful is if you have a system that is respecting and synergistic with nature. And there's a lot of things that we're taught to do that go counter to that. And those are the root causes of our failures. So really, deeply understanding what you're doing, the act of agriculture is not an industrial process, right? I mean, we've been trained to treat it like an industrial process to a large degree, where, you've got your products, everything's uniform, the sizing, the spacing, the machinery, everything else. But many of those things that you do actually have a negative effect on the overall health of the plant. Cell trays are a classic example of something where you are creating major early childhood development trauma for your plants by keeping their root systems locked up in these little cribs. If you never let a baby out of a crib until it was 6 years old, you would have a psychologically, emotionally maladjusted child that, if you put it out into the environment, would not flourish very well. If you put a tomato plant in a cell tray that's got 1 cubic inch of soil or 2 cubic inches of soil, and you keep it in there for 6 weeks, you've created a really stunted, psychologically, emotionally, plant. It does not have the capacity to properly engage with nature, with the environment. There's all these things that we do. I don't know how to go into one or another of them.
Yeah.
It's really, it's like a paradigm shift of perspective.
Yeah. So
it
I
takes
think
time.
One of the things you're saying is you need to question everything that you've been taught, and you need to really kind of pull everything back and look at what nature's showing you, and then kind of rebuild your beliefs based on that.
And ideally find someone who's much farther along than you are, and be very polite and gentle to them and ask for their guidance. The reason we've got apprenticeships and we've got conferences and courses and books and things like that is that we can, hopefully skip the first 20 years of mistakes when you start farming. But for somebody who grew up in a house in the suburbs and doesn't have all the common sense of being a farmer, that's kind of like that tomato seedling in the cell tray.
Yeah.
There's a lot of obvious stuff to somebody who's been doing it for 20 years that somebody who hasn't just can't see. Say, it should be a gentle process. If you're just going to quit your job and start farming and think you're going to make it, I would say slow and steady does it. Practice. It depends on where people are coming from. But there's a bunch of knowledge out there. Really avail yourself of it. I think that the level of understanding now is light years past where it was 20 years ago and even 10 years ago. There's a massive improvement in the data and the explanations to support this whole perspective. So I'd say it's a much better time now to get started farming than it was before, as far as like the knowledge and support you have available to you. Absolutely.
Even the Bionutrient Food Association website, there's so much on there with a library of different articles and things as well to read.
We've got, I'm not sure if it's hundreds of hours, but at least many dozens of hours of, courses from different people freely available, and, YouTube University. A lot of farmers are out there constantly listening to podcasts, which is awesome. I know how to weed carrots.
Yeah.
It's something to stimulate my mind.
Yes. Well, I learn how to make it so I don't have to weed carrots ever again.
Yes, exactly. I'm going to solve this problem systemically.
Yes.
I can put a couple of years of good hard effort in and like barely make it if that's what it takes to get established. But you don't want to be on this for the next 20 years. I'm just going to be barely struggling along, because you're going to get older and you're going to get tired and you're going to get worn out, and people in your life are going to get burned out, and it's all going to crash. So you gotta like really focus and dial it in.
All right. To kind of wrap it up, what would you say, Dan, your favorite farming tool is?
My favorite farming tool? I think it's my covering rake. It's basically, it's like an old hay rake with the wooden, tines, except it's got metal tines, because the wooden ones, rot and break. And that's what I use I generally broadcast my seeds.
Okay.
Certainly for salad greens, but for a lot of things I broadcast. Most of the root crops, carrots and beets and turnips and rutabagas, and some things I obviously do seedlings of, but tomatoes and kale and stuff. But a lot of the things I put in and the successions that I put in are broadcasted across an entire 4-foot bed. And so, because I've been doing this for 30 years, I can walk up a bed real fast with a handful of seed and just broadcast them out there, and then I come back down the bed with my rake, and we're done. I time it so it's before a rain, and 3 weeks later I'm picking $100,000 an acre worth of salad greens off of this little bed. Yeah. So I'd say it's my covering rake.
Very cool.
Or my scissors. I got this pair of scissors that's got about a foot long blades that I use for picking salad greens.
Okay, you're going to send me a picture.
I got it for $250 at Ocean State Job Lot.
Sometimes it's the cheapest things that are the most satisfying, right?
Real low tech. Yeah.
Dan,
cool.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Good talking. Looking forward to staying in touch.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
So there you have it, another episode in the books. So I'd love if you would hop on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and a review. Those mean everything to us. We love to hear what you're thinking. If you have a podcast guest that you can recommend, please pop on over to the Thriving Farmer Podcast website and leave us a review. That's thrivingfarmerpodcast.com.